So here's the question. How do you get your amp sims and programmed drums sounding less sterile within your productions? Also, if you have limited inputs, what's more important, a room mic on your drums or a snare bottom track on your drums? And finally, what exactly is a pro mix? How do you define that? Welcome to Viewer Questions Answered, episode 8. All right, so without any further ado, let's jump into this excellent group of questions sent in by email subscribers. And our first question comes from Josh. Hey Bobby, I have a bit of an odd question. With following you and other YouTubers, I've started making mixes that aren't bad. However, I feel like they're missing something. They're clear, but they feel almost sterile. My genre is more early 80s hardcore punk rather than metal. Could this be a result of using amp sims for all of the strings and programmed drums? I feel that saturation should help, but maybe I'm not using it correctly. Thanks for any advice. Okay, Josh, well, the question you asked is actually a very common problem that we have in the modern day when all of these tools that we use are almost too good in a way. And let me explain. When you're using programmed drums, the thing you have to remember is that these programmed drums are already processed by the people that developed this software, meaning they're already pre-EQ'd and compressed, and they're meant to sound great right out of the box. So when people watch tutorials on YouTube, a lot of times these engineers, like me for example, we're working with raw tracks that we recorded on our own. So let's say for example, you learn how to mix a kick drum or a snare or toms or overheads or room mic tracks from an engineer that's working with live drums. If you take that exact same approach and try to utilize it with your programmed drums, you're gonna end up with an overly sterile sounding drum track because you're double processing your drums. Now, I'm not saying to not process your programmed drums at all, but the key is to practice subtlety. The other issue with programmed drums to always remember is to pay close attention to the actual dynamics when you're programming them. A big mistake a lot of people make is that they peg out all of their velocities and their programmed drums sound like a drum machine because it's just full force 100% of the time. I like to follow a simple rule of thumb that my main velocities for the majority of my drum performances are around 110 as far as intensity on my MIDI notes for my programmed drums. This way I have a little bit of headroom if I want more of a impactful / aggressive sound. I can knock it up to 127, and I also have room where I can back it down for subtler, more soft sections. So that right there is what I find to be the two biggest culprits when it comes to programmed drums sounding too sterile, because it's a very common problem regardless of the genre of music you're working within. Now, as far as amp sims are concerned, if you've watched any of my videos, you probably know by now what I'm gonna say. By far, the #1 culprit with amp sims sounding like crap are when people are using bad sounding impulse responses. It's not your interface, it's probably not your guitar, as long as your guitar is somewhat maintained with new strings and setup and things like that. It's most likely the IR you're using and maybe the way you're tracking your productions. And with that being said, for anyone who's watching, if you're looking for a great sounding impulse response that needs minimal tweakage within a mix, you can download mine for absolutely free. There's a link below in this video's description. So Josh, in my opinion, you can achieve a nice, natural, even old school sounding production with programmed drums and amp sims without breaking the bank. It's all about how you're using the tools. Now, you also mentioned saturation, and you are correct. Saturation is an excellent tool when it comes to dialing in any mix, not only when you're dealing with programmed drums and amp sims, any mix in general, because when we record straight into our DAWs through clean interfaces, which we're all using, you need to use saturation to make your recording sound more like a record. Because most of the albums that we grew up listening to were recorded with analog gear and usually on analog tape through analog consoles. You don't have to overthink it, just use it on your drums, maybe your vocals, and that alone will give you a much more analog sound. It's not the most important element of a mix, but it definitely helps make your recording sound more, like I said, like a record. So to sum it all up, bad impulse responses, not paying attention to dynamics when you're programming your drums, and over-processing or over-mixing your programmed drums are by far the most common culprits when it comes to sterile sounding in-the-box program/amp simmed productions. So Josh, hopefully this answers your question and points you in the right direction. Keep me posted. Our next question comes from Gert, G-E-E-R-T. I hope I'm pronouncing your name properly. When recording at home, I'm DIing my guitars and bass and using Superior Drummer for my drums. I very easily get flooded with using way too many plugins on everything, or double, triple guitar tracks with different IRs. Question number 1. Would you mix a song while recording it or export the stems and then mix it? Question number 2, how to mix these already mixed drums. Question number 3, even when using the same setup every time, how do you get the end product from sounding the same, even though it's all the same guitar, superior drummer pack, etc.? And question number 4, would an EQ/compressor always be on the bus channels or the individual channels? Thanks from the Netherlands, Gert. Okay, well, Gert, you asked some excellent questions, and I'm gonna give you my philosophy and my workflow that I developed through the years, and also by learning from other producers that were way farther along than I was back when I interned. Here's the thing, people love to make things complicated, and it's not their fault. It's just information overload out on the internet when it comes to gear. And I know how it is because I used to be this way. So to answer your question about, exporting stems, then mixing them or recording them, and I don't do any of that. I simply record into Pro Tools, which is my main DAW, I edit, and then I mix. No exporting. Now, as far as committing, I do tend to commit, let's say I'm using an AmSim. Once I'm done recording, I'll commit the tone, and then I'll just mix it as it is, as if it were a live amp. And the same thing goes for programmed drums. I don't endlessly tweak my programmed drums when I'm mixing. They should be printed, in my opinion, and mixed just as if they were live drum tracks, because manipulating the performance is part of the pre-production/production stage, not part of the mixing stage. At least that's how I like to work. And I really like your question about, let's say you're using the same amp sims, the same programmed drums, how do you get them from sounding the same over and over and over again if you're using them on multiple projects? And the truth is, if you're working with different artists, I don't care if you're using the exact same gear over and over and over again, your productions will sound different. Let me give you an example. Back when I was doing live sound from time to time before the apocalypse occurred, I would have the same stage setup for each band at a particular show. So the same house kit, same cabs, and the amazing thing is even with all of the same gear, even if the bands were sharing the same heads, I had to completely do a new board mix in order to make each band work because all musicians play differently. Different genres of music call for different arrangements, different dynamics, pretty much different everything. So even with the same gear, all of these bands sounded completely different, and the studio is no different. I use the same house kit for 90% of the bands that come through my studio, and the drums always end up sounding different because drummers hit differently, guitar players pick differently, singers sing differently, and they have different, characteristics to their voices. So I really wouldn't worry about this, to be honest with you. As a matter of fact, if you do a little digging and watch interviews with some, big name engineers like Chris Lord-Alge or Steve Albini, a lot of these guys use the same gear for decades, and their productions, you could tell it's their productions because everyone has their own style, but they sound different depending on the band they're working with. And your final question, as far as EQ and compression on individual channels versus groups, I do both, and most mix engineers do both. You EQ and compress your individual channels, and let's say drums as an example, you would group your drums, send them to a drum group, and then EQ and compress your drum group to help glue your drum tracks together. So there is no right or wrong way. There are guys out there that are huge fans of top-down mixing, where they do the majority of their EQ and compressing on their buses or their submixes. And then there are guys out there that aren't the biggest fan of submixes. For example, Andy Sneap has always said that he doesn't even bus his drums. He does all of his drum processing on his individual drum tracks. There is no right or wrong way. It comes down to your own personal preference, your own personal style. So just experiment and see what you like best and what resonates with you best. So Gert, thanks again for these excellent questions. Okay, and our next question comes from, I'm not even going to try to pronounce this name, Kshitij. I have a problem when I use only 2 tracks, hard pan my rhythm guitars, and when I listen to the mix, there's usually a huge volume drop from stereo to mono. This frustrates me a lot. How do I fix it? Thanks, man. Well, Kshitij, that's an excellent question, and I have a very, very, very simple answer for you. Don't worry about it. What I want you to do is take a handful of pro mixes that you love that are commercially released and flip them into mono, and you're gonna hear that the volume will drop amongst most, if not all of them. There is no magic trick to this. I have found that if you have a slightly different guitar tone on both sides, this can help a little, but at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter because you really can't control it, at least as much as people would like to be able to control it. I used to obsess about this as well until I learned that's just the nature of when things are collapsed into mono, and to just simply forget about it. No mix is gonna sound amazing in mono anyway, so again, I wouldn't worry about it. Now, let me just say this. If you have a left guitar and a right guitar and they're the same performance and there are phase issues, then you're gonna wanna make sure that they're in phase so when they are collapsed into mono, they don't completely disappear. But if you have a different performance on the left and right sides, they shouldn't disappear 100%. There will always be a volume drop, but don't worry about that. Again, even on pro, commercially released, major label records, there's always gonna be a volume drop. So excellent question, but again, I wouldn't spend time worrying about it. Okay, and our fourth question comes from Blair, and he's asking you about drums. For recording drums, is it a big mistake to omit a room mic and or a snare bottom mic? How much of a difference do these mics really make overall? Can a plugin substitute for a room mic? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks. Blair, this is an excellent question because this frustrates me to no end when people send me stuff to mix and there's no snare bottom track. In my opinion, at least when it comes to hard rock and metal, you generally always want to mic both your top and bottom snares because that's what will give you a complete snare drum sound. Indie rock, jazz, R&B, country, the bottom snare might not be that important depending on the opinion of the engineer, but for me, I always want that sizzle of the bottom snare because for me, that's what gives a snare a nice 3D realistic sound in the mix. So I would say your bottom snare is more important than the room mic, but believe me, I wouldn't skip on the room mic either. Even if you're recording in a very, very, very small room, I don't care if you're using the crappiest, cheapest dynamic mic in the world, it's better than not using a room mic at all because I love to use a room mic to glue the sound of my kit together. Traditionally, engineers would glue the sound of their drum kit together by using the overheads, but in metal, overheads are usually just cymbal mics and the room mics are what glue the sound of the kit together, at least from the tracking side of things. So in my opinion, I wouldn't skip out on either one, but definitely not that snare bottom mic. You can sort of fake a room mic in the box using reverbs, but again, you really can't fake a snare bottom mic. What I always end up having to do if somebody sends me a session without a snare bottom mic, first I scream in anguish, but then I go and I put in MIDI information for every single snare hit, and I add a sample of a snare bottom because I always need that within my mixes, at least when it comes to heavy productions. Now, let me just say this, if you're curious to know how I would go about recording drums using only 8 channels, only a single 8-channel interface, I did a mini series a little while back where I did an entire production with only a handful of cheap microphones, only an 8-channel interface. And again, I did a whole entire production from tracking all the way through to the final master with no drum samples. I will leave a link below to the first video in that series. I'd highly recommend checking it out if you're interested in seeing how I went about recording the drums. And no, I did not skip out on either the snare bottom or the room mic, so check it out. Okay, Blair, thank you for your question. It was an excellent one. Now let's move on to question number 5. Hey, can you teach us how to use backing tracks effectively for guitar and bass? Regards, Jesus. Hey man, well, thank you for your question, and I'll give you my opinion from my experience from doing live sound at venues. If you're using backing tracks for live sound, I highly recommend keeping it as simple as possible for your drummer because you want to minimize anything that can go wrong during a live performance. And from mixing countless bands in live situations, by far the most stable and consistent way of doing it is to create a stereo track with one of the sides being the click track and the other side being a mono track containing any of your backing tracks that you want throughout the live performance. Now, yes, you can bring a DAW to the live show, but you're relying on a computer not crashing in front of a crowd full of people. And I've seen it happen countless times in front of a lot of people, and it is not a very comfortable situation. So in other words, an iPod or even a phone or a computer playing back a simple stereo file that's split into a simple mixer that the drummer controls, where he can control the level of his click versus the backing track, in my opinion, is the way to go. And all it takes, again, is to create a stereo track, one side being the click track and the other side being the backing tracks. You can stick bass, guitar, vocals, it really doesn't matter. It's just a mono track that can be sent to the front of house. So excellent question, and hopefully that answers it. And if anyone has any questions about this, if you want me to do a video on this, leave a comment in the comment section below and request it, and I might consider doing one in the future if there's enough demand for it. Okay, and our final question comes from Justin, and I love this question, so let's check it out. Hey Bobby, thanks so much for all you do with your channel. It's so incredibly helpful. Love how you keep things simple and straightforward. There's so much info out there that I think just overloaded my brain with stuff that doesn't even make sense with heavy music. This may have been covered before, but I think it's worth revisiting. What are the standout features of a polished professional mix? Is it the depth, the width, the automation for excitement, the overall balance, all the above? The core fundamentals are obviously critical, but just looking at what elevates the pro mixes the most. Thank you again for helping guys like me improve our mixes and recording techniques. Sincerely, Justin. Okay, Justin, this is an excellent question, and I'm gonna tell you the God's honest truth. The truth is that there's no one right answer, because if there's one thing I've learned from doing this for the last 16 years is that mixing and audio and music in general is extremely subjective. Let me give you an example. I love Andy Sneap. I'm a massive Andy Sneap fan. I have been since the very beginning, and I still am. But I've come across engineers that absolutely loathe Andy Sneap's work. I don't understand how, but they don't like his work for some reason. Another example, a good friend of mine, Ben Karras. He's a producer and also the violinist of the band Thank You Scientist. Check them out, they're very good. We do a lot of collaborating together where like he'll track a record and I'll mix it, or I'll track it and he'll edit it, things like that. And one thing I've learned is that we have very different opinions on production. For example, when he would send me references for what he wanted his band's record to sound like, a lot of them to me sounded like someone sticking an iPhone in the middle of a room. I didn't really get it, but at this point, I fully understand that we all hear differently and we all have different preferences. And that's what makes production so exciting, at least for me, in my opinion. If we all liked the same things, it would be extremely boring. And this is the same reason why when a band tries to hire me, whether it's recording or mixing, and they all of a sudden request for their mix to sound like, I don't know, a Joey Sturgis production, Chris Aldadji production, I will turn down the project immediately, because I'm not those guys and I can't make my production sound like those guys, but I can make my production sound like my productions. We all have different styles. Now, I know this isn't a straightforward answer, but it's the God's honest truth. Now, with that being said, when it comes to a pro mix, for me anyway, I can always spot it by the overall tightness of the performances and or editing, the clarity, if there's any apparent distortion going on or anything that doesn't sound musical to me. But with that being said, I hear some major label metal albums that I personally don't enjoy the sound of. I've heard some that to me sound like local band recordings. But again, that's just my opinion. Tonal balance, depth, dynamics are all extremely subjective, and it really comes down to the listener and the taste of the producer and the audio engineer. Some audio engineers love really compressed, overly hyped, overly processed sounding mixes. Other engineers prefer really raw sounding productions that use minimalist miking techniques with absolutely no editing and things being out of tune. There is no right or wrong. It all comes down to what you prefer and what you think sounds palatable and professional to your own ears. So Justin, I know that wasn't a straightforward answer, but it's the truth. Okay, so once again, I would like to thank everyone that submitted this excellent group of questions. And again, if I haven't gotten to your question yet, be patient. I will eventually get to it in one of these upcoming videos. And also, if you sent me a mix, again, be patient. I've gotten a ton of requests since my last mix critique video. I'll eventually get to it again within one of these upcoming videos on the channel. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. You can both like and follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the description below. And again, don't forget to download my free guitar cab impulse response of my favorite Mesa Boogie cab out of my studio, loaded with V30 speakers with an SM57 on the right spot of one of those speakers, so you can get right to dialing in killer metal guitar tone with absolute ease. Download the IR for absolutely free. Again, there's a link below in this video's description. Until next time, happy mixing.